I felt like an essential ingredient had been lost a little bit.
It's certainly for a reason that Da Ponte called it a dramma giocoso. We met, I think, for the first time in 2018, and I had heard of Louisa's work actually from her agent, or from one agent. I don't know if David Foster ever was your agent.
Oh, he was?
Yeah.
I wasn't even aware of that. That was a connection.
Yeah. And David was the first person to talk about you, and he sent me little clips of your work, and then I don't know how we got in direct contact.
Well, I know it was to Ara Guzilimian from Juilliard,
Yeah.
because he had followed my work, and he said, you must meet Mr. Neef, you should go to Toronto and have a meeting. And then auspiciously, it was the production of Rigoletto by our mutual friend and colleague, Christopher Alden, which I really loved. And that, I believe our first conversation was about Don Giovanni, partly.
You had just done Don Giovanni at Heartbeat. And then I think the second time you came was to see Vashti's abduction, but your plane was late and you never saw it.
I saw the last 20 minutes. Yes. It was a snowstorm, yeah.
Yeah, it was in February.
Very Toronto experience.
Yeah. We had known each other for quite a few years, and not in a way that we would be in regular contact, but I like to have a feeling for the people I work with, and I felt that I started having a feeling about who Louisa was as a director and the kind of work she was doing, and also because she always kept me informed about her work. When the idea came of Don Giovanni, I thought, who are we going to do this with? Are we going to do it with one of the usual suspects, or are we going to have an idea? It was more like a gut feeling, as you say in English, that I felt, I think I would like to do this with Louisa. And I called her, and she didn't say no. That was my story. Now you can tell yours.
You called me to have a conversation about the piece here in Paris, so I put myself in an airplane. And I think for me it wasn't completely clear yet. Was it an interview? Was it what was it exactly? But I was like completely delighted. And I mean, honestly, to be asked to do anything at the Opéra de Paris as an opera director, it's a total Cinderella moment, you know. But this piece for me has so much history, and it's really one of the pieces that has obsessed me since I was a child, actually, but certainly as an opera director. And so it felt like an enormous challenge that was enormously delicious. And so of course, when I realized it was an offer, I said yes, like wholeheartedly.
I think I first saw Don Giovanni on television in 1987, a live broadcast from the Salzburg Festival, which was one of Karajan's last productions there, which was at the Großes Festspielhaus with enormous sets and very traditional costumes, and everything was huge. But at that time I was a huge Karajan fan, so and for me as a young person, to be able to sit at home on television and watch all of this, which was great in Germany growing up. All the big summer festivals were on the radio and on TV. And I think that was my first encounter with the piece. I think I taped it. I must still have somewhere the music cassette with the music. And then I probably saw it again in Stuttgart at the opera when I started going to see live opera. In Stuttgart at the time, it also had a very, very traditional production by Göran Järvefeld, the Swedish director. It was very Scandinavian, very like cream-colored wood. It's like the theater in Drottningholm with period costumes. It was all very proper. And then I think they replaced that production later by a production by Hans Neuenfels, which was the exact opposite, totally insane. So I started feeling myself into the piece, I think first more musically, and then later on through different productions.
I thought for a moment you were going to have the same story when you said television, but because I also have a television moment. But I remember like singing Leporello's aria when I was a kid, because we definitely had the Karajan recording as an LP. And I think that's the amazing thing about Mozart, is that even as a very young person, the arias are so memorable and graspable that you instantly want to sing them. I definitely had I would say one of the most important moments as a director, when I turned on the television, I think I was maybe 11 or 12, and I saw a scene from Peter Sellers' Don Giovanni. And I think to me it was like a jolt of energy to realize that you could do Mozart like in the US today. And this was actually a very formative moment for much later, when I founded my opera company in New York, and we sort of wanted to insist that these stories can be told, you know, in the present, specifically American moment. But I think I just remember this sort of iconoclastic energy about that production and this incredible modernity at that moment. And though my reading of the piece is very different, I'm so grateful to that production and to Peter's whole project around the Da Ponte operas, because it just really was this great insisting that they be modern, that they be now.
I think it was a shock for a lot of people, those productions at the time. And I mean, a positive creative shock when they saw all of a sudden what was possible with that material.
But I think actually I would say before that, I definitely saw the Harry Kupfer production at the Komische Oper, which I must have been like 9 or 10. So I have a couple of vivid images from that. Like I know that Don Giovanni got right on top of Zerlina in the abduction, which as a young person was very impressive. And then I remember him actually eating chicken in the last scene and spitting it out. And there was something sort of...
No spoilers.
I don't know. Yeah. The 3 Da Ponte operas are like a cosmos, I think, as an opera director or as an opera lover. Once you enter it and you start to understand the interrelations and just the project of, formulating a certain worldview at a very, very crucial moment in history, you never really leave that system of planets. You just want to spend time there and keep unfolding it, because they're so endless, these pieces. They have so many layers upon layers upon layers. And I mean, the great thing about these pieces is that they have been looked at from so many different angles, and in hindsight it always says so much about the moment of time that we live in, how we receive this piece, I think. And I think that's especially so with Don Giovanni. And to me, when I first started thinking about doing it, 6-7 years ago with my company under very different circumstances, and it was a very, very different production from what we're making now, I was struck by the sort of recent tradition of overemphasizing the darkness and the propensity towards death and victimhood and misery in that opera. And I felt like an essential ingredient had been lost a little bit.
It's certainly for a reason that Mozart Da Ponte called it a dramma giocoso.
Exactly, and I think that's the devilish thing about that piece, is that it has these incredibly abrupt tonal shifts. And you have to, I mean, even if you look at the overture, it starts with this undescribable chord from the beyond that sort of shocks your system and takes you deep into some dark realm. And then the clouds sort of lift, and suddenly you have the most delightful, beautiful, sunny, life-affirming music. And I think it says everything about the span of sensibility that you need for the piece. But most especially, I would say my obsession became actually the 3 female characters in the opera, and how I felt like what I think is the extraordinary thing that Da Ponte and Mozart have done with Don Giovanni, and why I think this is sort of the enduring version of this myth, which has had so many different iterations in literature and opera and so on, is that they have shifted the focus not away from Don Giovanni. I mean, Don Giovanni obviously stays a majorly important character in the piece, but also towards the 3 female characters. And for the first time have given them 3 complete and incredibly exciting and complex arches and journeys throughout the piece. And I feel like deeply, deeply it's a piece about female desire and female love. And I wanted to sort of bring that back into focus. But how you do that is a big challenge politically, making it in today's world, I think. So I was just obsessed by the challenge of that. It was very in fashion. There was a very successful opera by Bertatti a couple of years before Da Ponte and Mozart chose the Don Giovanni as the subject of their next opera. So in a way, they were leaning into a fashion.
It was the ballet by Gluck.
Because they didn't have a lot of time. They had the second commission from Prague, and they knew they had to make something very quickly. And I think it was a popular subject. And I think what's always interesting and important to remember is that Don Juan, the myth, was like a fairground story. Like it's something as a child you would have seen acted out as by puppets, or maybe by commedia dell'arte comedians, on a wooden makeshift stage on a popular feast or a fairground. And so there was this kind of deep, deep popular appeal to the figure of Don Juan and the hell journey.
So it's a little bit in the vein of Marriage of Figaro.
Yes. Yes.
Because both subjects for the time, unusual subjects to choose to write an opera.
Yes.
When you look at, the very Metastasio-dominated field of what everybody else was writing.
But I think then, on the other hand, I mean, it hooked into obsessions of Mozart, and it also provides such an interesting contrast to Figaro, which is the opera they created as a team just before. And I think they were very aware that they were writing something quite different, and a little worried about it, especially when it came to Vienna.
And two French playwrights, Beaumarchais and Molière.
How-
And then the third, that's really interesting because Cousy is Marivaux.
So they all have French sources, actually.
So it's the French trilogy.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to see what they picked from the previous versions, and how they. I mean, I think isn't that always a little bit the case with masterpieces? Is that it's not necessarily about total originality. Like they often are not invented from scratch, but they're taking from a lot of different traditions. But it's then how they shift the focus.
It's what Verdi said, se non è vero è ben trovato.
When you put the Bertati libretto and the Da Ponte libretto side by side, it's actually shocking how similar some of the passages are, but then it's just always
A little bit better.
And just a little bit a lot better, I would say. It's very hard at the beginning. I think it's a lot of listening and reading and dreaming, and I think you have to, on the one hand, intellectually engage with the piece and its history and its sources and the politics and all of that. But then there's another process that I think is quite hard to articulate, which happens more on a gut level. And you sort of explore the rooms in a way, the inner rooms and the inner colors that you want to bring to the stage. And I think for me, actually, a huge impulse was that you said, we're going to make it in the Bastille, because it's a beautiful challenge. It's a little bit of a delicious impossibility. I mean, in the way in which I think you always need the impossible challenge to make something great. Because Don Giovanni, it's essentially a chamber piece. I mean, for 90% of the action, you have 7 characters, mostly in configurations of 2 and 3 and maybe 4 in very intimate situations. And so somehow you have to figure out how to take that wonderfully vast, cavernous space and to focus it in so that you can create this delicious sense of intimacy and almost spying upon very, very fragile things that happen between 2 or 3 people. The thinking about space often comes very early in the process and informs the finding of a concept. But I think the other thing, in terms of location, the kind of place that we chose for our production, it's interesting because in Figaro and in Cousy, you have worlds where everybody knows each other. Practically, everybody knows each other before the beginning of the opera. So they're sort of closed systems. Like you have a house or a castle, and you're dealing with all the inhabitants, and somehow there are complications and dramas. But with Don Giovanni, you have these 3 separate story strands and 3 groups of people that have no idea who the others are. They are complete strangers to each other. And then very ingeniously, they start to intermingle. And by 40 minutes into the opera, they're sort of inextricable, And so I think I thought a lot about the challenge of what is a place where that is plausible? What is a place where that happens, where strangers suddenly have very intense encounters and stories with each other, and a place that maybe also pushes people onto each other and creates this kind of density of action that you find in the opera. When the idea came, like a hotel, this place where, you have strangers, you have geographic collisions, you have these different strands of people and of social classes, it suddenly started, you just feel it when an idea starts to pull you, and suddenly it felt like it opened a lot of doors. And I think he's a monstrously complicated character, so I don't think it's easy to encapsulate, but I do have a very positive vision of the figure of Don Giovanni. To me, the interesting way to look at the figure, let's say, is to see him as a kind of shapeshifter chameleon whose genius consists in intuiting the secret desires, the fantasies of each woman that he encounters. And I think the opera becomes interesting when you say that they're not cliché rote seductions, but each seduction actually is hooking into that particular woman with all of her complexities, neuroses, adventures, secrets, what have you. And that somehow he manages to make himself like the projection surface for all that, which is, I think, why in the second step he then disappears. And whatever the woman has started to project onto him sort of starts to have a life of its own. And that's what's so maddening in the opera, is that then he's not there anymore and they have to deal with the absence of that. And I think that's very much also the movement of the whole opera, because if you look at the second act, I mean, the difficult thing about it, I think, for a director also is that Don Giovanni is like absent. Like in the second act, only Leporello, and then very, very briefly at the end, Elvira even interact with Don Giovanni as Don Giovanni. The rest of the characters either don't get to meet him at all, or they think that he's somebody else, or they think they're interacting with him, but actually it's Leporello. You know, so you have all the iterations of disappearance. But I think that has to do with this deep theme of the obscure object of desire, you know, something that was explored in a different way with the woman as the object of desire in Buñuel and Luis and so on. But in this case, interestingly, it's actually gender inversed.
I think it's a very clever approach, because it actually turns him from the villain that he often is in other productions into a somehow mythological figure. Yes. And we're going back to the myth of Don Giovanni, where he's so much more than just a character. And I think that's what's interesting about the opera. It's not like interchangeable with other people. Yeah. It's a very unique character in opera too. It's not like the Count, or not like really any other character in any Mozart opera. And maybe the only equivalent in all of opera is Carmen.
Yes, yes.
Right? And those are the two roles. They're just like no other role.
I think that's right. And both have a sort of key moment appealing to liberté, liberté, as the principle of their life.
Which
Viva
is one
la
of
libertà.
the key words in Don Giovanni, Viva la libertà.
And what is it? La chose enivrante, which is actually your season motto this season. Yeah. La liberté is, of course, the sort of rallying cry of Carmen. And I think it's a hard thing for modern dress, 20th century located productions to capture. I think just how transgressive the opera is in terms of thinking about class.
Well, I think the difficulty of these operas today is you have an audience that's not the audience of the world premiere, but you want to make them understand why it was so scandalous, so different, so impactful when it was first performed. Why did the first audiences of the piece react to it so strongly? You can't do the same thing that they did at the time because your audience is different. So you need to find a translation or a transposition to just bring our audience into this, what I call the original shock of the piece. See, very interestingly, in that very literal Karajan production that I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, there was no hell. Don Giovanni was consumed by the universe. There were like these space images and of planets and things that he got sucked into. So I think, again, it's metaphorical hell.
Yeah, and I think you need to find an adaptation somehow for it.
What does it mean?
What does it mean? Exactly, exactly. But then also you have this amazing coda of the sextet and these people who are left behind, who are also in a kind of hell because they don't know where to turn to anymore. And I think that's the great joke of the ending.
And where you have the second, what does it mean moment.
Yes.
Like as two, what does it mean moments.
Yes.
At the end of the opera. Probably closing the loop to the Dramma Giocoso. And there's also only, well, two other operas that end that way. It's Così and Rake's Progress. Rake's Progress, I think, is so much closer, of course, to Don Giovanni than Così, but it's also that it's, in the end, presented as a fable with universal meaning, not just as a story. That's what that epilogue is good for, to give it a completely different frame to the whole thing that people saw for the 3 hours.
Yeah, and at the same time, it's ironizing the idea of a moral ending. I think when they say, oh, everything's good now, he's in hell and we're here. I mean, there's a deep question mark in the music, because the music sort of peters out and it doesn't have a strong statement at the end. So even there, I think we're meant to ask, is it really so? And we will.